Picture this. You're living in the most powerful empire on earth, controlling nearly a quarter of the world's entire wealth. Your palaces glitter with precious stones, your gardens stretch beyond the horizon, and your armies are feared across 3 continents. But if you happen to be born a woman in 17th century Mughal India, all that power and glory could vanish in a single moment. One wrong move, one political miscalculation, one shift in the emperor's favor, and you might find yourself stripped of everything you once knew, forced to swallow the literal ashes of your former life. This isn't some Hollywood fantasy or dramatic legend passed down through generations of storytelling. This is the brutal reality that shaped the lives of countless women during one of history's most magnificent yet merciless empires. The Mughal Empire of the 1602 wasn't just wealthy beyond imagination. It was a cultural melting pot where Islamic rulers governed predominantly Hindu subjects, where Persian traditions mixed with local customs, and where women could wield incredible power one day and face unthinkable humiliation the next. Today, we're diving deep into this world of impossible contradictions, where the same empire that produced architectural marvels like the Taj Mahal also created a system so rigid and unforgiving that survival often meant abandoning everything you held sacred. We'll uncover how women navigated this treacherous landscape, the shocking practices they endured, and the incredible lengths they went to preserve their dignity in a world designed to strip it away. But here's what makes this story even more fascinating. While most people think of Mughal India as this exotic, distant civilization, the power dynamics, the family politics, and the impossible choices these women faced aren't so different from the struggles we see today. The stakes were just higher, much higher. The year is 1650, and the Mughal Empire stretches from the mountains of Afghanistan to the tropical shores of Bengal. Shah Jahan sits on the Peacock Throne, mourning his beloved wife Mumtaz Mahal and pouring his grief into the construction of her tomb, the magnificent Taj Mahal. But while poets sing of eternal love and architects craft monuments to devotion, the reality for most women in this empire tells a very different story. Let's start with what it actually meant to be a woman in 17th century Mughal India. If you were born into nobility, your life began behind walls. The Zenana, or women's quarters, wasn't just a section of the palace. It was an entire world unto itself, housing thousands of women from every corner of the empire. Imagine a city within a city, complete with markets, schools, gardens, and workshops, but surrounded by walls that most inhabitants would never cross again. Recent archaeological evidence shows these Zenanas were far more sophisticated than most people realize. They weren't just glorified prisons. They were complex social ecosystems where women developed their own hierarchies, their own economies, and their own forms of power. The head of the imperial Zenana controlled a budget that rivaled entire provinces. She commanded armies of servants, managed international trade routes, and influenced policy decisions that affected millions of people. But here's the catch that Hollywood movies never mention. All that power came with a price that would horrify modern sensibilities. You belonged to the emperor, not in some romantic fairy tale sense. You literally belonged to him, like a piece of valuable furniture or a prized horse. Your body, your children, your wealth, your very identity could be reshaped or destroyed at his whim. The women who survived and thrived in this system weren't passive victims waiting to be rescued. They were political masterminds who learned to play a game where the rules could change without notice, and the penalty for losing was often death. Take Princess Jahanara, Shah Jahan's eldest daughter. When her mother died, 17-year-old Jahanara didn't just inherit jewels and titles. She inherited control of the imperial seal, making her the most powerful woman in an empire of over 100 million people. Jahanara's story reveals how women could accumulate incredible wealth and influence within the Mughal system. She owned entire cities, commanded vast trading fleets that sailed to Arabia and Southeast Asia, and patronized architectural projects that rivaled her father's monuments. Her personal fortune would be worth billions in today's money. Yet she never married, never left the palace grounds, and never appeared in public without being completely veiled. This contradiction between power and confinement defined the experience of elite Mughal women. They could order the construction of massive public works, influence succession disputes that determined the fate of the empire, and control commercial networks spanning 3 continents. But they couldn't walk freely through the streets of their own cities or choose their own husbands. Now, let's talk about the women who didn't have Jahanara's advantages. The Rajput princesses, who found themselves caught between 2 worlds when their kingdoms fell to Mughal armies. These weren't just political marriages we're talking about. These were cultural extinctions disguised as diplomatic alliances. When a Rajput kingdom submitted to Mughal authority, the terms were always the same. Send your daughters to the imperial Zenana, convert your sons to Islam, and abandon the religious practices that had defined your people for centuries. For proud warrior cultures like the Rajputs, these demands struck at the very heart of their identity. But here's where the story gets truly shocking. Some women chose death over submission. The practice of Jauhar, mass self-immolation by Hindu women facing capture, wasn't some ancient ritual from barbaric times. It happened regularly throughout the 17th century, often involving hundreds of women at once. Picture the scene. Mughal armies surround a Rajput fortress. The siege drags on for months. Food runs low, the walls begin to crumble, and everyone knows the end is coming. As night falls, the women gather in the fort's central courtyard. They dress in their wedding clothes, hold their children close, and build an enormous fire. As the flames rise, Brahmin priests chant ancient mantras while the women walk into the blaze, choosing death over life in a Mughal Zenana. The next morning, the surviving men would smear the ashes of their wives and children on their foreheads and march out to face the Mughal army, knowing they would not return. These weren't random acts of desperation. They were carefully orchestrated rituals designed to preserve honor in a world where honor mattered more than life itself. But what happened to the women who didn't make it to the fire in time? What happened to those who were pulled from the flames or captured before the Jauhar could begin? This is where our story takes its darkest turn, and where the true meaning of being forced to eat ashes becomes clear. The Mughal system had a place for everyone, including conquered enemies. Women who survived failed Jauhars weren't executed. That would have been too simple, too clean. Instead, they were incorporated into the imperial household, given new names, new clothes, new identities. They were forced to abandon their religion, their language, their customs, everything that made them who they were. Imagine being a Rajput princess who had prepared for death rather than dishonor. You've watched your mother and sisters walk into the flames. You've said goodbye to everything you've ever known, but somehow you survive. Maybe you hesitated at the crucial moment. Maybe enemy soldiers pulled you back from the fire. Maybe you were protecting a younger sibling and couldn't abandon them. Now you find yourself in the Mughal Zenana, surrounded by luxury you've never imagined, wearing silk instead of cotton, eating delicacies prepared by imperial chefs. But every bite tastes like ash in your mouth because you know what it represents. You know that accepting this new life means betraying everything your family died to protect. This wasn't just psychological torture, though that was certainly part of it. The Mughals understood that the most effective way to break someone's spirit wasn't through physical punishment but through forced transformation. They would take these conquered women and systematically erase their identities, replacing Hindu names with Muslim ones, traditional clothes with Mughal fashions, Sanskrit prayers with Arabic verses. Some women adapted and even thrived in their new circumstances. They learned Persian poetry, studied Islamic theology, and carved out positions of influence within the imperial hierarchy. But others never stopped mourning their lost lives. They went through the motions of their new existence, while internally remaining loyal to their abandoned identities. The real genius of this system, if you can call something so cruel genius, was how it turned resistance into complicity. Every day these women continued to live in the Zenana, they were participating in their own cultural destruction. Every meal they ate, every conversation they had, every moment they didn't throw themselves from the palace walls was a small victory for the empire that had destroyed their world. And here's what makes this even more twisted. The Mughals didn't see themselves as the villains in this story. From their perspective, they were offering these women opportunities for advancement, education, and luxury that they never would have had in their original circumstances. They were bringing civilization to backward people, introducing sophisticated culture to primitive societies. This is where the metaphor of eating ashes becomes so powerful. Ash is what remains after fire consumes everything valuable. It's tasteless, colorless, without nutrition or substance. For these displaced women, their new lives in the Zenana were like being forced to survive on ashes while surrounded by a feast they could never truly enjoy. The cultural collision between Mughal and Rajput traditions created unique forms of suffering that went beyond simple physical hardship. These women had to navigate between two completely different concepts of honor, two different ways of understanding their place in the world, two different definitions of what it meant to be a woman. In Rajput culture, a woman's honor was tied directly to her chastity and her loyalty to her birth family. Death was preferable to dishonor, and dishonor was defined as any situation where these core values were compromised. But in Mughal culture, honor came through elevation within the imperial hierarchy, through accumulation of wealth and influence, through successful navigation of court politics. The women caught between these worldviews faced impossible choices every single day. Should they embrace their new circumstances and try to build meaningful lives within the Mughal system? Or should they maintain internal resistance at the cost of constant psychological suffering? There were no good answers, only different forms of survival. As we'll see in the next part of our story, some women found unexpected ways to bridge these cultural divides, creating new forms of identity that honored both their origins and their circumstances. Others never stopped plotting their escape or revenge, spending decades planning for opportunities that might never come. And a few discovered that the ashes they were forced to swallow could be transformed into something resembling nourishment if you knew the right techniques. The 17th century Mughal Empire created a laboratory for human resilience, unlike anything the world had seen before or since. The women who lived through these experiences developed survival strategies that would make modern psychologists marvel at their sophistication. But understanding how they did it requires diving even deeper into the specific mechanisms of power, resistance, and adaptation that shaped daily life in the imperial Zenana. What most people don't understand about surviving in the Mughal Zenana is that it required a complete rewiring of your brain. These women had to develop what we might call psychological shapeshifting, the ability to maintain multiple identities simultaneously without losing their sanity in the process. Let's follow one particular woman through this transformation. We'll call her Kamala, though that wasn't the name she carried by the end of our story. Kamala was a Rajput princess from a small kingdom in Rajasthan that fell to Mughal forces in 1652. She was 16 when the siege ended, old enough to understand what was happening but young enough that her identity wasn't completely fixed. When the Jauhar began, Kamala made it halfway to the fire before turning back. Her 5-year-old brother had hidden behind a stone pillar, too terrified to move. She couldn't abandon him, couldn't let him die alone. That moment of compassion saved both their lives and condemned them to something far more complex than death. 3 days later, they were in a Mughal caravan heading toward Delhi. Kamala's brother cried constantly for their mother. She told him stories to keep him calm, Rajput legends about brave warriors and clever princesses. But each story felt like swallowing glass because she knew they were the last traces of a world that no longer existed. The journey to Delhi took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of gradual transformation that began before they even reached the imperial capital. The Mughal escort wasn't cruel, exactly. They provided food, clean clothes, protection from bandits. But they also began the systematic process of identity erasure that would define the rest of Kamala's life. First came the language lessons. A Persian tutor rode alongside the caravan, teaching basic phrases for palace life. Please and thank you, and yes, my lord, and no, my lady. Simple words that carried enormous weight because each one represented another step away from her original self. Kamala learned quickly because quick learners survived better than slow ones. Then came the religious instruction. Morning prayers facing Mecca instead of toward the rising sun. Quranic verses instead of Sanskrit hymns. The tutor wasn't harsh about it, just persistent. Like water wearing away stone, the constant repetition gradually reshaped her mental landscape. By the time they reached Delhi, Kamala could hold basic conversations in Persian and recite enough Islamic prayers to avoid immediate suspicion. She wasn't Muslim, not really, but she could play the part well enough to blend in. Her brother adapted even faster, because children's minds are more flexible than adult ones. The imperial Zenana in 1652 housed nearly 8,000 women from across the known world. Portuguese seamstresses worked alongside Turkish musicians and Bengali cooks. African guards stood beside Persian scholars and Arab merchants. It was the most diverse community on earth, united only by their shared confinement and their dependence on imperial favor. Kamila's first shock was discovering that many of the women genuinely loved their lives there. Not all of them were prisoners or captives. Some had volunteered to join the Zenana because it offered opportunities they never would have had in their original circumstances. Education, luxury, the chance to influence imperial policy through pillow talk and strategic alliances. The head of Kamila's section was a former Uzbek princess who had arrived 30 years earlier under similar circumstances. She'd been captured during one of Akbar's Central Asian campaigns, brought to court as part of the spoils of war. Now she managed the household finances for over 300 women and controlled a personal fortune that rivaled minor kings. This woman, who called herself Gulnar, became Kamila's mentor in the art of imperial survival. She taught her that resistance didn't always mean rebellion. Sometimes resistance meant becoming so valuable to the system that destroying you would be counterproductive. Gulnar's lessons were subtle but devastating. She taught Kamila how to leverage her exotic Rajput heritage as a mark of distinction rather than shame. How to tell stories about brave Rajput warriors in ways that entertained Mughal audiences while secretly preserving her cultural memory. How to practice Hindu rituals disguised as Islamic ones, maintaining spiritual connections to her abandoned faith through carefully coded gestures and prayers. Most importantly, Gulnar taught Kamila about the economy of attention within the Zenana. Imperial favor was a finite resource that had to be carefully managed and strategically deployed. You could accumulate it through exceptional beauty, unusual talents, political connections, or simply by being useful to more powerful women. But you had to spend it wisely because once you lost imperial attention, you became invisible. And invisible women in the Mughal system might as well have been dead. Kamila discovered she had a gift for languages. Within 2 years, she could speak fluent Persian, passable Arabic, and enough Turkish to communicate with the guards. Languages became her currency in the Zenana's complex social economy. She translated letters, mediated disputes between women from different cultures, and gradually built a network of allies who owed her favors. But every skill she developed felt like a betrayal of her original self. Every day she became more valuable to the Mughal system was another day she moved further away from the Rajput princess who had once existed. The ashes she was forced to swallow weren't just metaphorical. They were the literal ashes of her former identity, consumed one small piece at a time until nothing recognizable remained. Her brother adapted differently. He was enrolled in the imperial school system and began training for military service. By age 10, he spoke better Persian than Hindi and had forgotten most of the Rajput stories Kamila had told him during their journey to Delhi. Watching him transform was like watching herself disappear in reverse, seeing what complete assimilation looked like when it happened to someone you loved. The psychological toll of this transformation was enormous. Kamila developed what modern doctors would recognize as dissociative episodes, periods where she would lose hours at a time, functioning normally but with no memory of what she'd done or said. Her mind was protecting itself by compartmentalizing experiences that were too contradictory to process consciously. During these episodes, she would sometimes revert to her original language and customs, speaking Hindi to confused Persian servants, or attempting to perform Rajput prayers in the middle of Islamic ceremonies. The other women learned to cover for her during these moments, understanding that anyone could break under the pressure of maintaining multiple identities simultaneously. But Kamila also discovered something unexpected during her years in the Zenana. She wasn't the only woman struggling with fractured identity. The Portuguese seamstresses missed their Christian masses. The Turkish musicians longed for their homeland's folk songs. Even some of the Persian noblewomen felt isolated from their ancestral traditions by the artificial court culture of the Zenana. This shared experience of cultural displacement created unlikely alliances across ethnic and religious boundaries. Women who should have been natural enemies according to their home cultures became sisters in their common experience of forced transformation. They developed secret languages, hidden rituals, and coded ways of preserving their original identities while appearing to embrace their new ones. The most remarkable example was the underground network that developed for protecting children born in the Zenana. These kids grew up without any connection to their mother's original cultures, but some women worked desperately to preserve fragments of their heritage for the next generation. They would teach traditional songs disguised as imperial hymns, tell ancient stories repackaged as entertainment for Mughal audiences, and pass down cultural practices through games and seemingly innocent activities. Kamala became part of this network after her own daughter was born. The child's father was a minor Mughal official who had been granted visiting rights as a reward for some forgotten service to the empire. Kamala never learned his name and saw him only 3 times, but their daughter represented both hope and despair. Hope because the child might have opportunities Kamala never could. Despair because those opportunities would come at the cost of complete disconnection from Rajput heritage. Naming the child became a political act disguised as personal choice. Kamala wanted to call her Priya, a Sanskrit name meaning beloved, but Sanskrit names were forbidden for children of the Zenana. Instead, she chose Priyanka, which sounded similar but had acceptable Persian etymology. It was a small victory that felt enormous to someone who had been forced to surrender so much. Teaching Priyanka became Kamala's new form of resistance. She couldn't tell her daughter directly about Rajput culture, but she could embed fragments of it into acceptable activities. Traditional dance moves incorporated into Persian choreography, ancient melodies hummed as lullabies, stories about brave princesses who happened to share characteristics with historical Rajput queens. The irony was that this indirect approach to cultural transmission sometimes worked better than direct teaching might have. Priyanka absorbed these cultural fragments naturally, without the psychological resistance that explicit instruction might have provoked. She grew up feeling connected to something ancient and powerful, without fully understanding what it was. But Kamala's success in preserving pieces of her heritage came with a devastating personal cost. The more energy she devoted to maintaining her original identity in secret, the more exhausted she became in her daily life. She began to experience what we might now recognize as chronic depression, a persistent sense of emptiness that no amount of imperial luxury could fill. The Zenana's medical system had no understanding of psychological illness. Physical ailments was seen as a spiritual problem that required religious with herbs and bloodletting, but mental suffering solutions. Kamala was encouraged to pray more, fast more, meditate more, as if her depression was a failure of faith rather than a natural response to impossible circumstances. Some women in similar situations chose suicide as their final act of resistance. They would throw themselves from palace walls, poison themselves with carefully hoarded toxins, or simply refuse to eat until they wasted away. These deaths were always covered up by imperial authorities, but word spread through the Zenana's secret communication networks. Every suicide became a form of inspiration for other women contemplating similar escapes. Kamala considered this option many times, especially during her darkest periods when maintaining her dual identity became almost unbearable. But her daughter's existence anchored her to life in ways she hadn't anticipated. Suicide would have been a personal liberation, but it would also have condemned Priyanka to grow up without any connection to her cultural heritage, however fragmented and hidden that connection might be. Instead of choosing death, Kamala chose a different form of resistance that was both more subtle and more subversive than outright rebellion. She began to weaponize her cultural knowledge, using her understanding of Rajput traditions to help other displaced women navigate their own identity crises. She became an unofficial therapist for the Zenana's walking wounded, the women who were slowly dying from spiritual starvation, even as their bodies thrived on imperial abundance. This work was dangerous because it involved acknowledging realities that the Mughal system preferred to ignore. Officially, all Zenana women were supposed to be grateful for their elevation to imperial status. Admitting that some of them were suffering from cultural displacement would have undermined the entire ideological foundation of Mughal expansion. But Kamala discovered that helping other women process their own cultural grief was also helping her process her own. By teaching them techniques for maintaining hidden connections to their abandoned identities, she was strengthening her own psychological survival mechanisms. It was like building an immune system against cultural extinction. The network of women she helped gradually became an informal resistance movement within the Zenana. They weren't plotting violent revolution or attempting dramatic escapes. Instead, they were engaged in something far more threatening to imperial authority. They were refusing to completely disappear. The sophistication of this resistance network would have impressed modern intelligence agencies. These women developed communication systems that could operate under the constant surveillance of unit guards and imperial spies. They created codes using embroidery patterns, where specific combinations of stitches and colors conveyed messages about cultural preservation activities, emotional support needs, or warnings about increased imperial attention. Kamala became particularly skilled at what they called shadow teaching. During official Persian poetry recitations, she would subtly alter pronunciation and emphasis in ways that created double meanings for women who knew how to listen. A poem about imperial gardens could simultaneously be instructions for maintaining Hindu prayer practices. A song praising Mughal military victories could contain embedded Rajput folk melodies that stirred ancestral memories in listeners who had almost forgotten their origins. The most dangerous aspect of this work was teaching the children. Priyanka was now 7 years old and beginning formal education in the imperial system. Every day, she learned more about Mughal history, Islamic theology, and Persian literature. But every night, Kamala would quietly undo portions of this indoctrination through bedtime stories that seemed innocent but carried deeper messages. The technique required incredible precision, too obvious, and imperial educators would notice the contradiction between daytime and nighttime lessons. Too subtle, and the cultural transmission would fail completely. Kamala had to calibrate each story, each song, each seemingly casual comment to plant seeds of alternative identity without triggering the surveillance systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of cultural preservation. Other mothers in the network faced even more complex challenges. A former Bengali princess was trying to teach her son traditional music while he trained for military service in the imperial army. An Ethiopian woman captured during Red Sea trading expeditions was preserving her people's oral history through what appeared to be children's games. A Greek merchant's daughter was maintaining Orthodox Christian prayers disguised as Islamic meditation practices. Each woman's situation required different strategies because imperial authorities had learned to recognize and counter obvious forms of cultural resistance. The Mughals weren't naive about the potential for rebellion among conquered peoples. They had dealt with uprisings, assassination attempts, and escape plots for over a century, but they hadn't fully grasped the threat posed by this quieter form of resistance. The turning point came when Kamala realized that her survival techniques were beginning to spread beyond the Zenana's walls. Some of the unit guards, themselves victims of cultural displacement from various parts of the empire, were secretly learning these methods for maintaining hidden identities. Palace servants from conquered territories were adapting the communication codes for their own use. Even some lower-ranking Mughal officials whose mothers had been foreign concubines were quietly seeking out these preservation techniques. What started as a desperate attempt by displaced women to maintain their sanity was evolving into a broader movement that challenged the fundamental assumptions of imperial cultural policy. The Mughals had always believed that conquest followed by integration would eventually create a unified imperial identity that superseded local loyalties. But Kamala's network proved that cultural extinction was far more difficult to achieve than military conquest. The discovery that resistance was spreading created both opportunities and dangers. On one hand, it meant that the techniques these women had developed were genuinely effective and could help preserve cultural diversity across the empire. On the other hand, it meant that imperial authorities would eventually notice the pattern and take countermeasures that could destroy everything they had built. Kamala began to document her methods, using a cipher system based on traditional Rajput textile patterns. She hid these records in the geometric designs of carpets and wall hangings that decorated her quarters. To casual observers, they appeared to be nothing more than artistic decoration. But to someone who understood the code, they contained detailed instructions for cultural preservation, psychological survival techniques, and methods for building covert support networks. The irony was that she had to use skills learned in the Mughal education system to preserve knowledge that the same system was trying to eradicate. Her Persian literacy allowed her to create documents that could survive imperial scrutiny. Her understanding of Islamic art forms provided camouflage for Hindu cultural content. Her knowledge of court politics helped her identify which officials could be trusted and which represented threats to the network. This intellectual synthesis created something entirely new in her mind. She was no longer purely Rajput or purely Mughal, but something hybrid that incorporated elements of both cultures while remaining fully loyal to neither. The ashes she had been forced to swallow were beginning to nourish a different kind of identity, one that existed in the spaces between official categories. The psychological transformation was profound but also deeply unsettling. Sometimes Kamala would catch herself thinking in Persian without realizing it, or finding genuine beauty in Mughal poetry that she was supposed to hate. These moments of authentic appreciation felt like betrayals of her original self, but they were also signs that her mind was adapting to survive in ways that pure resistance never could have achieved. Her relationship with her daughter became both the greatest source of meaning in her life and the most painful reminder of what had been lost. Priyanka was thriving in the imperial education system, showing particular aptitude for mathematics and astronomy. She spoke Persian like a native, displayed genuine devotion during Islamic prayers, and seemed completely comfortable with her identity as a Mughal princess. But occasionally, usually when she was tired or emotional, Priyanka would hum melodies that Kamala recognized as fragments of Rajput folk songs. She would unconsciously arrange her hair in styles that echoed traditional Hindu patterns. She would ask questions about her grandmother that revealed she had absorbed more cultural information than either of them had realized. These moments gave Kamala hope that the preservation work was succeeding, but they also filled her with terror. If imperial authorities noticed these cultural residues, both she and Priyanka could face punishment that ranged from exile to execution. The line between successful cultural transmission and dangerous exposure was impossibly thin. The network faced its greatest test when a new imperial inspector arrived to investigate reports of cultural contamination within the Zenana. This official, whose name was Mirza Hassan, had built his reputation by uncovering and crushing various forms of resistance throughout the empire. He specialized in identifying the subtle signs of cultural preservation that less experienced investigators might miss. Hassan's methods were sophisticated and terrifying. He didn't rely on obvious surveillance or direct interrogation. Instead, he studied patterns of behavior, analyzed linguistic choices, and looked for inconsistencies between official identities and unconscious cultural expressions. He could identify a hidden Christian by the way she crossed herself when nervous, or spot a closet Hindu by subtle variations in how she prepared food. The women in Kamala's network had to completely alter their preservation activities while Hassan conducted his investigation. The embroidered communication system was suspended. The shadow teaching methods were temporarily abandoned. Even private conversations had to be carefully monitored because Hassan was known to plant informants who could blend seamlessly into existing social groups. But Hassan's presence also revealed something unexpected about the broader imperial system. His investigation uncovered resistance networks that Kamala hadn't even known existed. There were Sikh merchants maintaining their religious practices through coded business transactions. There were Afghan military officers secretly teaching their sons Pashto poetry. There were even some Persian nobles who were preserving pre-Islamic traditions that predated the Arab conquest of their homeland. The scope of cultural resistance within the empire was far larger than anyone had imagined. Hassan's investigation revealed that the Mughal policy of cultural integration had created not a unified imperial identity, but a vast underground network of parallel cultures that maintained themselves through increasingly sophisticated concealment techniques. This discovery changed Hassan from a hunter of resistance into something more complex and dangerous. He began to see his work not as preserving imperial unity, but as documenting the failure of imperial cultural policy. His reports started including recommendations for more aggressive measures to achieve complete cultural assimilation, including proposals that would have horrified even hardline imperial administrators. Hassan recommended separating children from their mothers at birth to prevent cultural transmission. He proposed creating specialized schools designed to identify and eliminate cultural contamination in young minds. He suggested implementing loyalty tests that would expose hidden cultural affiliations through psychological manipulation techniques. Most terrifyingly, he began to argue that the current policy of incorporating conquered peoples into the imperial system was fundamentally flawed. Instead of trying to transform them into Mughals, he suggested, the empire should simply eliminate them and replace them with more reliable populations from the imperial heartland. These recommendations created a crisis within the imperial administration. Moderate officials recognized that Hassan's proposals would require resources the empire couldn't afford and would likely trigger widespread rebellion. But hardliners saw his analysis as confirmation of their suspicions that cultural diversity was inherently subversive and needed to be crushed completely. The debate over Hassan's recommendations took place in council meetings that Kamala and her network could only observe from a distance through carefully cultivated sources among palace servants. But the implications were clear. The empire was moving toward policies that would make their current forms of cultural preservation impossible to maintain. The women faced a terrible choice. They could abandon their resistance activities and hope that complete submission would protect them from the new wave of cultural suppression. Or they could intensify their preservation efforts, knowing that discovery would now mean not just personal punishment, but potential genocide for their entire communities. Kamala found herself in a position she had never imagined when she first entered the Zenana 15 years earlier. She had become not just a survivor but a leader whose decisions could affect the cultural survival of thousands of people across the empire. The scared 16-year-old who had been forced to eat the ashes of her former life had evolved into someone who might be able to transform those ashes into the seeds of cultural renaissance. But the price of that transformation was becoming someone she barely recognized, someone who thought in multiple languages simultaneously, someone who could find beauty in the very system that had destroyed her original world, someone who had learned to love her captors even while working to undermine everything they represented. The ashes were no longer just something she was forced to consume. They had become part of her, changing her from the inside out in ways that were both liberating and horrifying. The question was whether the person she was becoming could find a way to preserve what mattered most while surviving what threatened to destroy everything she had worked to protect. The weight of leadership in impossible circumstances was crushing Kamala in ways she hadn't anticipated. Every morning brought new intelligence from her network about Hassan's expanding investigation. A Bengali woman had been questioned for 3 hours about inconsistencies in her prayer posture. An Armenian seamstress had disappeared entirely after someone reported hearing her sing in her native language. The walls were closing in, but running wasn't an option when thousands of people depended on the preservation methods she had helped develop. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Priyanka, now 8 years old, had been assigned to help with Hassan's documentation project as part of her advanced studies. Imperial educators saw this as excellent training for a bright student, giving her exposure to high-level administrative work. What they didn't realize was that they were placing a child trained in cultural code switching directly into the heart of their investigation. Priyanka's position gave Kamala unprecedented access to Hassan's methods and discoveries. Through carefully coached conversations that appeared to be normal mother-daughter chatter about schoolwork, Kamala learned that Hassan had identified not just isolated resistance cells but entire family trees of cultural preservation spanning multiple generations. The scope was staggering. Hassan had traced networks connecting palace servants to provincial administrators, to military officers to merchant families. He had discovered that some of the empire's most trusted officials were secretly maintaining the very cultural traditions they were supposed to be eliminating. The investigation had revealed that Mughal cultural policy hadn't failed in a few isolated cases, but had failed systematically across the entire imperial structure. This discovery created an opportunity that was both brilliant and terrifying. If Hassan's investigation continued to its logical conclusion, it would expose so many people that the empire would face mass executions or widespread rebellion. Either outcome would destroy the careful balance that allowed the preservation networks to function. But if Hassan's investigation could be redirected or discredited, it might create space for these networks to operate more freely. Kamala began developing what she privately called the mirror strategy. Instead of trying to hide from Hassan's investigation, she would feed it information that was technically accurate but strategically misleading. She would help Hassan discover resistance networks that were already defunct or controlled by imperial loyalists, while protecting the ones that posed real threats to cultural assimilation. The technique required incredible precision and nerves of steel. Kamala had to provide Hassan with enough genuine discoveries to maintain his confidence in his sources, while ensuring that those discoveries led him away from her most important operations. She was essentially teaching the Empire's most skilled cultural hunter to hunt himself. The first test came when Hassan's investigation identified a Kashmiri music teacher who had been incorporating traditional melodies into imperial compositions. This teacher, an elderly woman named Lakshmi, had been one of Kamala's earliest allies in developing cultural preservation techniques. Exposing her would validate Hassan's methods and encourage him to dig deeper into the network. Protecting her would require sacrificing someone else. Kamala made the hardest decision of her life. She provided Hassan with evidence pointing to a different music teacher, one who had been collaborating with imperial authorities to identify cultural resistance among her students. This teacher was actually working against the preservation networks, but her methods were subtle enough that Hassan would see her as a successful cultural preservationist who needed to be eliminated. The strategy worked perfectly and destroyed Kamala's soul simultaneously. Hassan arrested the wrong teacher, convinced he had uncovered a major resistance figure. The real preservationist, Lakshmi, remained free to continue her work. But Kamala had to watch as an innocent woman, however misguided her loyalties, faced interrogation and exile for crimes she hadn't committed. This moral compromise became the template for Kamala's campaign to misdirect Hassan's investigation. Over the following months, she systematically fed him information that led to the arrest of imperial collaborators, corrupt officials, and cultural enforcers who had been making life miserable for preservation networks throughout the empire. Hassan thought he was crushing cultural resistance, but he was actually eliminating the people who made cultural resistance most difficult. The irony was exquisite and horrifying. Kamala was using the empire's own cultural suppression apparatus to eliminate the empire's most effective cultural suppressors. She was turning Hassan into an unwitting ally, while convincing him that he was winning a war against cultural preservation. The manipulation required her to become someone she barely recognized, someone capable of coldly calculating which innocent people could be sacrificed to protect her broader mission. But the strategy was working. As Hassan arrested more supposed resistance leaders who were actually imperial loyalists, he was inadvertently creating power vacuums that genuine resistance networks could fill. Provincial administrators who had been particularly harsh in enforcing cultural assimilation policies found themselves under investigation for secret cultural contamination. Military officers who had specialized in crushing local traditions were arrested for allegedly practicing those same traditions in private. The preservation networks began expanding into spaces that had been closed to them for decades. Cultural practices that had been driven completely underground began emerging in carefully controlled ways. Children who had been forbidden to learn their ancestral languages started receiving instruction disguised as imperial education programs. Traditional art forms that had nearly disappeared began appearing in modified versions that satisfied imperial censors while preserving essential cultural content. Kamala's daughter Priyanka became increasingly valuable as both an intelligence source and a proof of concept for the preservation methods. Her success in the imperial education system while maintaining hidden connections to Rajput culture demonstrated that complete cultural assimilation wasn't inevitable. Children could learn to navigate multiple identity systems without losing their essential selves, but Priyanka's position also made her a potential target if Hassan's investigation eventually turned in the right direction. The more successful she became at maintaining her dual identity, the more dangerous her existence became for everyone connected to the preservation networks. Kamala found herself in the impossible position of being proud of her daughter's achievements, while terrified of the attention those achievements might attract. The psychological strain of maintaining multiple deceptions simultaneously was enormous. Kamala had to convince Hassan that she was a loyal imperial subject while secretly undermining his investigation. She had to maintain her cover identity within the Zenana while coordinating resistance activities across the empire. She had to protect her daughter while using her as a source of critical intelligence, and she had to preserve her own sanity while making moral compromises that violated everything she had once believed about honor and dignity. Sleep became elusive as the weight of responsibility pressed down on her. Every decision affected thousands of lives. Every mistake could trigger a cascade of arrests and executions that would destroy generations of cultural preservation work. The 16-year-old girl who had once prepared for death rather than dishonor had become someone who chose survival over purity, effectiveness over integrity, strategic victory over moral clarity. The transformation was complete in ways that both empowered and horrified her. She could manipulate imperial bureaucrats with ease, coordinate complex intelligence operations without leaving traces, and make life-or-death decisions about people she had never met. But she could no longer remember what it felt like to make choices based on simple moral principles rather than strategic calculations. Hassan's investigation reached its climax when he announced that he had identified the central coordination point for cultural resistance throughout the empire. His analysis indicated that all the various preservation networks were ultimately connected through a sophisticated command structure based somewhere within the imperial capital. He was preparing to launch a massive operation to capture this central leadership and destroy the entire resistance infrastructure simultaneously. Kamala realized with growing horror that Hassan's investigation was pointing directly toward her, not because he had discovered her specific activities, but because his analytical methods had correctly identified the patterns that indicated centralized coordination. He didn't know who was running the networks, but he had figured out that someone was running them, and he was systematically eliminating all other possibilities. The story of women like Kamala reveals something profound about human resilience and the price of survival. These weren't just victims of imperial conquest. They were architects of cultural preservation who developed techniques so sophisticated they're still studied by historians today. They learned to transform the very ashes they were forced to swallow into seeds of resistance that would outlast the empire that tried to destroy them. What makes their story so relevant today is how it demonstrates the hidden costs of assimilation and the quiet heroism of those who refuse to completely disappear. Every immigrant family, every displaced community, every person caught between conflicting cultural expectations faces echoes of these same impossible choices. The methods may be different, but the fundamental challenge remains the same. How do you preserve what matters most while adapting to survive? The Mughal Empire eventually crumbled, but the cultural preservation networks these women built survived for centuries. Their children's children carried forward fragments of traditions that were supposedly extinct, proving that identity is far more resilient than empires. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields, but in the quiet spaces where people choose to remember who they used to be, even when the world demands they forget. The ashes these women were forced to eat became the soil from which new forms of cultural expression eventually grew. Their story reminds us that survival isn't always about resistance or submission. Sometimes it's about the courage to become something entirely new while honoring what came before.